What if one verse in Genesis contains a mystery that changes how you see creation itself? Most of us learned that Genesis 1 describes God making the world from nothing, but some of the deepest Bible readers have noticed something that doesn't quite fit that story. Genesis 1:2 uses language that sounds less like a beginning and more like restoration. The earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the deep. That's not how you usually describe something being created fresh. That's how you describe something broken waiting to be remade. This observation has sparked one of Christianity's strangest and most compelling theological questions. What if God wasn't creating the world in Genesis 1? What if he was restoring one that had already fallen? This idea is called the gap theory, and it's haunted serious Bible scholars for centuries. It connects Lucifer's rebellion, Satan's fall, and the ruined earth into one dramatic narrative. And it raises questions that make you wonder what you've been missing in Genesis all along. The verse itself is simple enough to read. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's Genesis 1:1, and it seems complete and final. But then comes 1:2, which shifts the tone entirely. Now the earth was formless, and empty darkness was over the surface of the deep. The word "now" is where the mystery begins. In Hebrew, it's the word "vayhi," which can mean "and it came to pass" or "and it became." It suggests something happened between verse 1 and verse 2. The original earth existed, but something changed it fundamentally. The phrase "without form and void" is where the real debate ignites. Most modern translations use soft language like formless or empty, but the Hebrew words are much stronger. Tohu vavohu. Tohu means desolation, chaos, emptiness, in a way that suggests ruin. Vohu intensifies it, creating a sense of complete devastation. These aren't the words you'd use for unfinished creation waiting for detail work. They're the words you'd use for a world that once existed and had been destroyed. The Bible uses similar language elsewhere to describe actual judgment and catastrophe. In Isaiah 34:11, God describes a land of judgment using the exact same words. When Jeremiah describes what happens to a land under God's judgment, he uses the same vocabulary. This linguistic pattern suggests that Genesis 1:2 is describing devastation, not simple incompleteness. The darkness covering the deep adds another layer to this image. Darkness in Scripture is rarely neutral. It carries weight, danger, and judgment throughout the Bible. When God creates light, he separates it from darkness, as though darkness is something to overcome. But here darkness dominates completely. The deep waters themselves are described in ways that echo chaotic waters before creation. This isn't the peaceful waters of an untouched world waiting for organization. This is the turbulent waters of a world that has experienced catastrophe. Then comes the Spirit of God moving over these waters. Most translations use words like hovering or brooding for how the Spirit moves. These words suggest care, restoration, bringing order back to chaos. The Spirit isn't appearing for the first time here. The Spirit is returning to do restoration work on something that once was. This is the crucial detail that shifts the entire interpretation. If the earth was simply unfinished, why would restoration language appear? Why would the Spirit need to move over chaos and bring it back to order? This is where the gap theory enters the conversation. The theory suggests that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, something catastrophic happened. In that gap, perhaps centuries or eons passed. In that gap, a previous creation existed, and in that gap, judgment came. The gap theory locates Lucifer's rebellion in this space. Revelation 12:7 describes war in heaven between Michael and Satan. Lucifer didn't rebel after humanity was created. Lucifer rebelled before Adam ever existed. So when did that rebellion happen? Perhaps it happened in this gap in the age of a previous world. If Lucifer ruled over a previous creation and rebelled against God, what would that cost? His rebellion would spread to the angels under him, creating a cosmic war. The judgment would be total. The earth he ruled would be destroyed. The order he corrupted would be unmade, and all that would remain is the formless ruin described in Genesis 1:2. This interpretation connects several prophetic passages in ways that feel almost seamless. In 2 Peter 3:5-7, Peter describes a world that long ago was formed out of water. He then says that world was destroyed, being flooded with water. He's describing the flood of Noah, but he uses it as a parallel to how the current world will be destroyed by fire. This implies there could be multiple creations and destructions in God's plan. Why couldn't there have been one before the flood? Jude 6 mentions angels who abandon their proper dwelling and are now bound with everlasting chains. These aren't angels who rebelled at the end of history. They're angels already judged and awaiting final execution. Could these be the angels who rebelled with Lucifer in the gap? Could their judgment already be locked in? Isaiah 45:18 adds another intriguing detail. God says he did not create it to be empty. The Hebrew word here is again tohu, the same word, describing the formless earth of Genesis 1:2. If God didn't create the earth to be tohu, then why is it tohu in Genesis 1:2? Unless something happened to change it from what God originally created. But here's where the objections arise. And they're not small ones. Many Bible scholars argue that the gap theory reads too much into the text. They say that Genesis 1:2 is simply describing an unfinished creation. The earth is without form, because God is about to give it form through the 6 days. The darkness is simply the absence of light before God speaks light into existence. Nothing has been destroyed. Nothing needs restoration. God is simply creating in stages. The Hebrew grammar, they argue, doesn't require a gap at all. The word vehi doesn't necessarily indicate a massive time break. It's simply a narrative connector, moving from one scene to the next. In Hebrew storytelling, you often have a setup statement, followed by detailed description. Genesis 1:1 is the setup. God created everything. Genesis 1:2 is the beginning of detail work. Here's what he found when he looked at it. Translation matters here more than anywhere else in this debate. The King James Version translates Genesis 1:2 in a way that sounds more dramatic. More modern translations soften it. The earth was a formless void. Some translations add words not in the Hebrew to clarify the meaning. Now the earth was formless. These translation choices actually shape how readers interpret the whole question. What remains undeniable is that Genesis 1:2 uses language of restoration, the Spirit moving, bringing order to chaos, organizing the deep. These are restoration metaphors. Whether that restoration is of a previous world or of an unfinished one is where interpreters divide. The Bible doesn't explicitly state a gap. The Bible doesn't explicitly name a previous creation, but the language creates an opening for this interpretation, and that opening may be intentional. The Bible is filled with mysteries that reward wrestling. The wisest biblical scholars often acknowledge that some passages hold depths we're still discovering. Genesis 1:2 might be one of those passages where the text invites multiple faithful interpretations. Some see a fresh creation with careful steps. Others see a restoration after judgment. Both perspectives respect the text. Both perspectives wrestle with its language honestly. What this interpretation changes is how you read the entire creation account. If Genesis 1-2 is restoration rather than raw creation, then Adam and Eve aren't simply the first human attempt. They're humanity rebuilt after judgment. Eden isn't God's first garden. It's his replanted garden after chaos. The careful days of recreation take on deeper meaning. God isn't just organizing matter. He's demonstrating that his power can restore even after catastrophe. This carries into how you understand evil's origin too. Satan isn't presented as a surprise in Scripture. He's always in the story as a corrupting force. In this interpretation, his rebellion and judgment preceded human history. His fall came before Adam's creation. This doesn't change the gospel message about redemption through Christ, but it does expand your sense of how long God's redemptive plan actually is. The Bible clearly confirms certain things throughout all this debate. God is the creator of all things. Adam is the first man, the father of all humanity. Eden was a real garden with real history. The flood of Noah was a real historical judgment. Jesus Christ came to redeem creation from sin and death. These truths stand whether or not the gap theory is correct. What remains truly uncertain is whether that gap existed at all. The strongest evidence is linguistic. The language of Genesis 1:2 does sound like restoration. The strongest objection is logical. The Bible doesn't explicitly state a previous creation. Both sides point to real clues in the text. Both sides acknowledge they're connecting dots that Scripture doesn't explicitly label. This is actually where the mystery becomes most spiritually valuable. Genesis 1:2 doesn't demand a single interpretation. It invites you to think deeply about God's nature. What does it tell you about God that even chaos can be restored? What does it reveal about judgment that it can be so total? What does it suggest about redemption that God would rebuild? The deeper question might not be whether the gap theory is right. The deeper question is why this one verse has captured the imagination of serious believers for centuries. It's because Genesis 1:2 contains genuine mystery. It uses language that could mean what many interpreters have suggested, and it sits at the foundation of all we believe about creation, judgment, and restoration. You're left with an invitation, not a demand. Read Genesis 1:2 again. Look at the actual Hebrew words if you can. Notice how the imagery shifts from verse 1 to verse 2. Does it feel like fresh creation, or does it feel like something broken being remade? Let the text speak to you. Let the mystery draw you deeper into Scripture. And let the question, was God creating the world or restoring one that had already fallen, become part of how you think about the God who speaks worlds into being.